most of you present here. So it's a great pleasure to be here. And I especially want to thank the Department of Sanskrit and India, especially Dr. Wilson, for having me here today. And the reason I landed here is because of my thesis, which has been on hermeneutics, incidentally. And I never intended it to be on hermeneutics. It's a trench that I landed myself in. And the hermeneutic circle that we have been discussing is responsible for that, and I'll come to that. So, as you can see, the title of my thesis is The Epistemology and Whatever Scripture Hermeneutics, and all-time favorite topics of Indian philosophy, the Vedanta. So that's what I'm going to focus today on. And before that, as I'm also glad that I'm speaking after all of you, because most of the basics are clear now, and we have been discussing hermeneutics in like two manner. Dr. Ravi Gupta mentioned that there is a technique of. So hermeneutics can be understood as a philosophical discipline and also as a technique of interpretation. And I am obviously, my focus is Vedanta and Vallabha scripture and hermeneutics, so I'm not going to go into the details of these topics, and most of these contexts are clear. But what I want to highlight here is that hermeneutics as a philosophical discipline, probably Schleiermacher's idea of understanding, is more closer to the Hindu culture of hermeneutics than as a technique of interpretation, because that basically evolved out of biblical studies. And I want you guys to probably answer that what is one difference that you find, as probably after his presentation it's more than clear, that we spoke about the multiplicity in Indian tradition, and that's probably the one difference that we find. So when hermeneutics evolved out of biblical discipline, that led to the clash of ideas. And one of the fantastic essays that I read it's a journal, it's a Springer journal edited by Rita Sharma, and Arvind Sharma's essay on that, the hermeneutics of the word religion and its implication for the world of Indian religions. So he made a wonderful point that obviously this doesn't cover everything about the Western model of religion, but the 2 points that we are highlighting here is one of the exclusive membership, as he just mentioned, that this idea that as you refine your thought, you lead to one. So therefore, the Western model of religion was allegiance to one religion at a time, just one. You cannot have multiple adherents. And the separation of culture and religion. So these were the two basic ideas of Western model of religion, and it came to India through obviously the colonial rule. And at that time, the British conducted a census to allocate religion and for good governance, administration, all of these things, to see what is the major religion of India. And they faced problem with Hindu-Sikh community, they faced problem with Hindu-Muslim community. And when I say Hindu-Muslim community, I don't mean Hindu community and Muslim community. What I mean is communities which adhered to both Hindu and Muslim religion at the same time. So they had difficulties identifying themselves as one of these religions. And it was enforced, which led to the birth of Hindutva ideology. Now it's not a political discussion whether the ideology worked or not for India, but we understand that Hindutva ideology was actually a socio-cultural response of Hinduism against Western implication of hermeneutics on India. That's what Arvind Sharma states here, as I quote, that Savarkar was trying to maintain the unity and integrity of Indic religious tradition threatened by the application of exclusive Western concept of religion to it. By drawing upon another feature of the use of the word in the West itself, its distinction with culture, as a remedy for what he perceived as a problem caused by the introduction of Western concept of religion in the Indian milieu. So obviously the separation of culture and religion was the problem, and Savarkar turned it around that we'll use that as a remedy, because Hindutva now represents culture, not just people who follow Hinduism as a religion. So that's, but it led to a lot of problems, as we found. So that model, so hermeneutics, which evolved out of this model of religion, probably wouldn't work for India. So what we instead need for India is a method of, or a technique of hermeneutics which acknowledges the diversity which is so inherent to the tradition. And that's why we turn to something that is followed through traditions in India, as we know that every person who tries to interpret the scriptures actually engaging in some form of hermeneutical exercise. So obviously the acharyas have done it. And so Rita Sharma, in her introduction, makes a point in the same journal. By the way, it's a fantastic collection of essays, that hermeneutics and Hindu thought towards a fusion of horizons. And she says in her introduction that hermeneutic ranges from ontology to epistemology in Indian tradition. And I want to highlight that in my present thesis that I'm going to talk about, it also overlaps with the soteriological motives. So the salvific will of the Lord, it overlaps in that field as well. So that's how diverse the tradition is. You just simply cannot limit any particular exercise to epistemology in Indian tradition. It is invariably going to overlap. And she says that the blurred line between the philosophy and theology, which we all acknowledge, furthered the problem of implications of Western hermeneutics in India. As you see, I've quoted Edgerton in the Upanishads, the very famous essay, the Upanishads, what do they seek and why? Probably it's the most scornful essays written on the Upanishads, I'm sorry to say. And as you can read the quote, they say that they are primarily religious rather than abstractly philosophical, and the historic origin of their attitude and primitive ideas about the magic power of knowledge is still perfectly clear in them. So, as it's very clear from the quote, that there is no attempt made to take context into account, the diversity into account, and Upanishads are primarily seen as religious and proposing some magical, fanciful ideas about heaven and this, and it's mostly this worldly. So they believe it's not even religious because it's more this worldly. So that's another criticism of Upanishads. So this is what happens when you look from a different lens. And so Rita Sharma says that, therefore, the system of commentarial literature known as Bhashya becomes the first genuinely Hindu hermeneutical strategies. Because now the critique of the Upanishad came from the Western scholars later. It first came from the heterodox Indian schools itself. It came from the schools which opposed the authority of Vedas, which led to the beginning of some kind of a response to answer the challenges that were posed, and the evolvement of sutra literature. That's how we got Brahma Sutras, to kind of summarize the Upanishads so that we don't think that it's magical and fanciful. It's also philosophical. So the emergence of sutra literature, and then but this transferring knowledge through sutra literature is probably something very unique to India. Because it's sutra, because it's aphorisms, what it leads is, it opens for more interpretations, because it's aphoristic. So obviously complex ideas are communicated through aphorisms, and therefore it leads to more interpretations, which is, as we have seen with his essays, not a problem for India at all. We cashed on the opportunity to create bhashyas. So, and that was Rita Sharma says, that becomes first genuinely Hindu hermeneutic strategies. And from that is so the Bhashya, Vallabhacharya's Bhashya on the Brahma Sutras is where I construct my hermeneutics from. So that became the evolution of Pramana Vada, or Pramana Shastras. Now, this is only to show you that I'm going to be focusing more on the latter. So the Pramana Vada, it's both the epistemological system of determining the sources of knowledge and also ascertaining the knowability of something. That how do you know something? So it's both. And On one end, it responds to the challenges to the Vedic authority, and on the other hand, it is also intra-Vedantic debates where somebody who is accepting the Vedic authority, but because there are contrasting statements within the scriptures itself, so it's a multi-layered system of interpreting the Vedic text, which is probably more of my focus today. So this very roughly done presentation is more for me than for probably you, because I have this very amazing habit of going astray when I speak. I'm lengthening my thing, which probably makes me a good PhD student. I'm very distracted when I write or speak. So, okay, so when we come to hermeneutics, I'm going to narrow down the focus as far as possible to arrive on Vallabha's hermeneutics. So there are many themes of Vedantic hermeneutics, but one of the recurring inquiry that we find in intra-Vedantic hermeneutics, people who accept the Vedic authority, is to align the diverse narratives of the ultimate reality. So we all accept Brahman as the ultimate reality. Somebody who is accepting the Brahma Sutras and commenting on that is accepting Brahman as the ultimate reality. But the problem is aligning the diverse narratives about Brahman, which leads to different schools of philosophical thoughts. And so they are taking Upanishads as their hermeneutical raw material and trying to align its diverse narratives, because there has to be some kind of cohesion to arrive at a point. So, and this is not something, Vallabha tries to do that as well, and most prominent aspect of his hermeneutics is about aligning these diverse narratives. But he's obviously not the first acharya or preceptor to do it, because this is so pronounced that you find it in the tradition itself. Like you find the Brahma Sutras addressing this problem. In the Brahma Sutra I've mentioned, talks about the Ubhaya Linga, that the Brahman is Ubhaya Linga. And then the Bhagavata, also the third, I've mentioned the third canto of the Bhagavata, which begins with Vidura's inquiry about the multiplicity of narratives about Brahman. So it has been addressed in our tradition itself. And to address this, the Vedanta commentators occupy various exegetical positions. But, of course, we know about the system, the epistemological system that predominantly developed after Shankara, accepts the authority of the Prasthana-Trayi. Now, in this Prasthana-Trayi, there are certain schools which kind of also include the Puranas, especially the Bhagavata, as an important pramana. Now, not to say that other acharyas are not accepting Bhagavata as a pramana, but they are not as serious about it as these schools are. And I'm especially highlighting the traditions of Chaitanya and Vallabha here, because most of the richest commentaries on Bhagavata we find from these two schools, and especially from Chaitanya school, because for a long time we didn't have a commentary on the Brahma Sutra, because Bhagavatam itself was believed to be the commentary on the Brahma Sutra, if I'm not wrong. So these schools, and then it complicates the problem. The reason it complicates the problem is because there is a discernible exegetical preference for the Saguna manifestation of ultimate reality as Bhagavan in Puranas. Now we'll stick to Bhagavata for this thesis. So we have this preference for the Saguna manifestation as Bhagavan in Bhagavatam. And when you accept that as pramana, without disregarding or overriding it over Brahma Sutras, so you have this dichotomy of Nirguna Shrutis and Saguna Shrutis, which has been repeatedly addressed by the commentators. And so both this Chaitanya and Vallabha tradition view Bhagavata as the commentary or a more detailed exposition on the ideas expressed in the Brahma Sutras. It is not a text that conflicts the description of the Nirguna Brahma. That is their view. So how do you then kind of smoothen these differences? Because they do not see a difference there. So here is where I'm going to present Vallabha's point of view, that accepting Bhagavata, how does he align the Nirguna and Saguna narratives? And as I've said, that Arthoyam Brahma Sutranam, which is a Garuna Purana shloka, which is also saying that, yes, Bhagavata is the meaning of Brahma Sutra. So both Chaitanya's view as Bhagavata being the commentary on Brahma Sutra, or Vallabha's view as it is a more detailed exposition. He doesn't see Bhagavatam as a commentary because he has written one himself, but he sees it as a more detailed exposition, and we'll arrive to that shortly. So then we come to Vallabha's system, which is most repeatedly stated that he talks about the Pramana Chatushtaya, the fourfold system of scriptural testimony. Now, I couldn't be more wrong to say that, this is Vallabha's epistemology. This is what I thought to be for a very long time until I hit the hermeneutical circle. So I thought that this is Vallabha's system of scriptural testimony. Well, then what happened was I intended to write a thesis on bhakti, especially Nirguna Bhakti in Bhagavatam. And my problem was that as a practitioner, as a Vaishnava practitioner, and coming from Vallabha tradition, I'm looking at Bhagavata. So I have an exegetical position in mind. So am I interpreting the text through the lenses of an exegetical position that I already have, or am I deriving my exegetical position through the interpretation of the text because it's a pramana? So that was the hermeneutic circle, and I don't say that I found an answer after writing this thesis. If I do, then I would not be a researcher, because we never tend to find answers. That's what qualifies me. But this tend to bring me to, this led me to this trench of hermeneutics to find out what Vallabha eventually did. How does he gets to his exegetical position through these four shastras that he considers as pramana, which led me to these two very diverse verses from Vallabha's writings. One is from Anubhashya, which is his commentary on the Brahma Sutra, when he states that it is viciously erroneous to even have an iota of inferential thought that goes against the scriptural statements. Even an iota of inference. So which means we are stressing on literal translation, literal understanding of the scriptures. And then you have one from Bhagavatarth, which is a commentary on the Bhagavata, where he says that even misinformation and ignorance, ajnanam and anyatha jnanam, can be considered as pramana if they arise out of cultivation of devotion, bhakti hetukam. And I was like, what is he doing? So what is this? These two are so diverse, and when you come across a statement that does not make sense to you, the first thing you do is look at the context in which it is said. And that's what I did. So when I looked at the context of the Bhagavatarth statement, I've highlighted that in bold, the bhakti hetukam, if they arise out of the cultivation of devotion. It's relevant because here he's talking about devotion, not just at the beginner stage, but the zenith of devotion, when you reach the pinnacle of your devotion. So it's kind of the phala avastha, as we say, when your devotion is ripened. It's talking about that stage. And the Anubhashya commentary is clearly the beginner's level. So because I'm trained in Western narratives, I can't force myself to find a linear structure everywhere. So I was very happy that I found a linear structure here. That is, the first statement is at the beginner's level, and the last statement is at the final stage. So there has to be an intermediate level. That is what my conditioning did to me. So there has to be an intermediate level, which will probably put this into a context. And that's where one of the most celebrated commentator of Vallabha tradition, Dr. Hermeneutic Goswami, I found his interpretation, which aligned to mine, that we have actually 3 stages of scriptural hermeneutics in Vallabha, which will align this. So, as the first juncture is the rudimentary understanding of the 4 key texts, which are collectively known as Pramana Chatushtaya. So you understand the text and the nature of ultimate reality according to these texts. That's your primary juncture of discourse, which is Updeshakalina Prathamikta. Then you have the second stage, where you go on to include not only the 4 principal texts, but every scripture that is under the authority of Vedas, like the Ramayana, Mahabharata, Narada Pancharatri, all these Puranas and other Agamas that are accepting the authorities of Vedas are also pramana for you. But not at the beginner stage. First, get your facts straight, as they say. So get your facts straight at the four principal texts. Then you move on to include all the other scriptures at pramana. Tatparya Bodhottara Kalin. We'll go into a bit of details of this, that how he gets there. And finally, at the third juncture, Vallabha embraces the validity of all philosophical tradition, which also includes the Nastika darshan. Whether it's a Gnostic darshan, whether it's a misinformation, whether it's an ignorance, everything is pramana, because they are ultimately talking about Brahman, because there is no other subject matter to talk about except Brahman. It's not just possible to talk about anything else than Brahman. So that is Brahma Sakshatkar Kalina Tritiya Tala. So we'll go into a bit of details of this. Now, before we get into these primary juncture, I want to point out that one of the things I said was it's viciously erroneous to even have the iota of inferential thought, which means we are stressing on literal translation. That gets me to this, the thematic context of Vallabha's hermeneutics. When you're stressing on literal translation, the problem you're going to face is the contrasting statements. If you're not inferring anything out of it, if you're literally accepting, so how do you align the contrasting statements? And so Vallabha actually says that you don't need to align them. You have to accept them. Don't try and align them. The problem is that Ramanuja and Madhva has constantly criticized Shankara for giving predominant importance to the Nirguna Shrutis over Saguna Shrutis. So it's like you're ignoring one part of the text and accepting the other. And he says, but you are doing the same thing. You're giving more importance to the Saguna Shrutis. So you are actually doing the same thing. So what you need to do is accept both. And so I'm quoting Marfatya here, Mridula Marfatya, who states that how do these acharyas circumvent these critical difficulties of contrast narratives is by attributing Brahman as the repository of auspicious attributes or contradictory attributes. Now, auspicious attributes is Ramanuja, basically. That's what I feel she's referring to. But then again, what about inauspicious attributes? So, and so we'll focus on Vallabha, where he says that all the contradictory attributes, which he uses the word Viruddha Dharmashraya, is Brahman, and that's how you are not smoothing or aligning the difference, you are accepting the difference, that because you are trying to understand Brahman from your individual context, then it becomes difficult, but the larger picture actually makes it clear. So, and therefore he goes on to make a very blasphemous statement that there is no internal or external distinction, and yet he is Vilakshan, or he is distinguishing Brahman from the nature of both physical world and individual selves. So both from Sat and Chit, he is distinguishing Brahman, but insisting there is no internal, Swagat, Sahaj, any kind of Bheda. So, and that is why Vallabha, S.M. Doyle says that Vallabha's philosophy is a system that is more rigid than Shankara when it comes to non-dualism, and it's more emotive than Ramanuja when it comes to devotional theism, because he's kind of everywhere, covering both grounds. So how do you actually do that? So you have the context of Viruddha Dharmashraya. So that is the ideal we want to arrive at in Vallabha's hermeneutics. So the primary juncture is what you do is, so he says that one hermeneutical misstep each acharya, he never names any acharya, but anyone can commit, is understanding these four scriptures independently as pramana. What he's trying to say is you have to find the ekvakyata, or a singular meaning across scriptural statements, and unopposed significance, or the avirodhatva that comes out of them. And how do you actually do that? So he gives like the hierarchy, that whatever difficulty you have with Upanishad, you resolve it through Gita, whatever difficulty you have with Gita, you resolve it through the Sutra, Brahma Sutras, and whatever difficulty you have from Brahma Sutra, you resolve it to Bhagavatam. So he states an example saying that, so you have an Upanishadic verse that apanim pado javano grahita, which means that without hands or feet, he is grasping and running. And so how do you make sense of this contradictory statement? He says that Gita says sarvatah panim padam tat. So he has hands and feet everywhere. So what it actually means is that Brahman does not lack hands, limbs, but the world, the entire universe is his limbs. So that's how you align the scripture and arrive at a singular focal point of commonality. Now this is not the end step, because otherwise this is a synthesis and we reach the conclusion. No, this is the first step. Your synthesis is your first step. So you arrive at a commonality, which is the principle of Viruddharmashraya. That is what he says, that when you align the diverse narratives, you arrive at Viruddharmashraya. And then you reach the secondary juncture. That once you understand the Viruddharmashraya, you also understand that there is a fundamental notion of non-duality, which is Tattvataya Advaita, but there is a playful duality, which is Leelatmik Dvaita. So this playful duality is obviously taken from the Upanishads' concept of creation, which says that Brahman created this out of his own joy and for his own play, Brahmana. So that's how we arrive. So once you arrive at this vision, that the duality or the multiplicity you see is just playful, like a stage that has been set. So it's a stage that has been set, and one actor can perform multiple roles, and Brahman can do that simultaneously. That's another contradiction or Viruddharmashraya that you find in Brahman, that you can either be a spectator or a performer. You can't enjoy both, but he can do both at one time because he's Brahman. So that's what you arrive at. With this understanding, you move to accept his saguna forms, because you have understood the essential commonality, the nirguna from the Vedanta, and then you move to the saguna manifestations and align the two. And that's what he calls the Purna Jnanodaya at this stage. So at this stage, this epistemological need to constantly align or smoothen out the contrasting statements is removed. You no longer feel that. You have learned to accept it. And that's where we reach the final stage. And that's when the supreme reality, because now this is accepted, the amount of effort you put in, you're never going to grasp the entire truth. This is accepted. So, but when you reach the stage of acceptance, that's when the reality reveals itself to you. And that's where I was saying that it kind of goes into the realm of salvation or soteriology, because here there's a concept of supreme reality revealing yourself to you, which is Brahma Sakshatkar, which it literally means the direct revelation of Brahman. And so when you have the supreme reality revealing itself to you, you have this expression of divine bliss. That's what you experience. Instead of confusion, the contrasting statements that earlier, the hermeneutics that led to confusion, now it leads to bliss. So it's the contrast is no longer confusing for you, but it's blissful for you. So when you reach that stage, the concept of Viruddharmashraya is not just cognized as the nature of supreme self, but is also experienced by the individual self as a part of his own nature. For akin to Brahman, who manifests as empirical world and yet remains unblemished, individual self, too, purified through devotional love of Brahman, begins to essentially disengage from the limited duality of the empirical world and continues to enjoy it as an expression of divine play. So here, this contrast, which we are earlier limiting it to the supreme reality, that it is both nirguna and saguna, is now translating to the seeker as well, that you accept the nirguna and enjoy the saguna. So as your own part as well, that you accept you're an undistinguishable part of that supreme reality, but like to be different just for the sake of this sheer bliss of service and love and devotion, because that's not possible without difference. So, the crux of this epistemological structure is the theological claim that even the philosophical systems that do not explicitly state Brahman as their fundamental subject matter are still expounding the particular facet of Brahman, for there is nothing else except Brahman that can be stated as the subject of human inquiry. So whatever you set to find out, you're going to find out Brahman, but there is no other reality there. So that's the height of Advaita that he is proposing here. Hence, all the varied, contrasting, and multidimensional postulations of different scriptural argumentation can be subsumed in Brahman. And this acceptance, as I said, is noticeably distinct from Vallabha's rejection of the non-Vedic text at the secondary juncture. And so this philosophical system kind of aligning itself to Brahman is not the genius of each philosophical system, that whatever they say leads to Brahman. It's not their genius, but it's the nature of Brahman that whatever vocabulary you use, he has the nature to align himself to that vocabulary. So whatever term you use to describe himself, he can be that term. There is no restriction that you can put on it. And that's why it leads to it. And so we finally arrive at this soteriology, epistemology integration of hermeneutical understanding, that is pramana, prameya, sadhana, and phal. So here, theological system, it's densely integrated with epistemological quest in such a way that liberation constitutes the transcendental purpose of epistemological inquiry. At the same time, epistemology is the instrument to facilitate your spiritual journey. So they are integrated in that way. And so pramana is your source of knowledge, object of knowledge. After you achieve your knowledge, you engage in the means of achieving that, and which leads to the end of your spiritual practice. So in that way, pramana and prameya, as you can see, founds the epistemological unit, and sadhana and phal forms the soteriological unit. However, when the ultimate reality reveals itself to you, these both, the entire system of Pramana Shastra can be overturned, is what he's claiming, which probably I find it most blasphemous. That all the Vedic descriptions that you are so holding as primary pramanas can be overturned by the revelation. Because so ultimately he's laying the importance on your personal experience, then the textual significance. That your personal experience, if it goes against the scriptural testimony, then you have to believe your personal experience, because that's the direct revelation, and you've been blessed by that. So this whole system of Pramana Shastra can be overturned. It is for people who have not reached probably the phala. It's not for everyone. And so he says that scriptures that propound jnana and bhakti are only for the purpose of complete awareness and conception of the absolute truth. And if the Supreme Lord himself appears before the seeker, the tools of jnana and bhakti, along with the scriptures, become purposeless. So once you reach the end goal, the scriptures become purposeless. That's what he is trying to portray here. So I would like quickly try and summarize the whole thing, that Viruddharmashraya constitutes the scriptural conceptualization of Brahman as the seat of contrary attributes, which is formulated according to the outlines of threefold epistemological hierarchy. Then you have the concept of Brahma Sakshatkar, the revelation, which is the apotheosis of Vallabha's epistemology, which leads to two interactive domains. One, it develops an ontological position that the observable world is an ongoing expression of divine play, and its dynamic mosaics can be redesigned by the Supreme Lord at his divine will. So nobody else can redesign it, he can. And secondly, it argues that while mutually interdependent system of epistemology and soteriological unit function methodically in the ordinary world, this process of hermeneutical comprehension and salvific praxis can be intervened and reconstructed at any given point, either by the devotee or by the Lord himself, both ways. So if your devotion is strong enough, you can reconstruct it as well. So that's the level it goes to the personal experience. And finally, we arrive at the conclusion that so we find that his method of scriptural interpretation encompasses the contrary attributes itself. For instance, when he strictly asserts the unquestionable authority of the infallible Vedic scriptures, he also goes on to smoothly integrate the non-Vedic ways of thinking into the wider scheme. So even his hermeneutics has this tendency of Viruddharmashraya, which is attributing to Brahman actually. And as we have found that he doesn't feel that this contradiction in his hermeneutics is the limitation, but it is actually the conceptual design that is stating the thematic motive of his exegetical and theological system. And so which helps him to build a comparable scriptural hermeneutics. And finally, the concept of Viruddharmashraya provides a method of exegetical reading that consolidates various contrasting philosophical standpoints and scriptural statements rather than epistemologically negating or dissolving them, and leads one to envision all-encompassing concept of Brahman as both wholly other and the most intimate reality. Of course, it can be argued that this is pushing the envelope too far by making other system interpret Brahman. Well, then you have to remember that he's not talking of interpreting the scriptures in that way, but it is one's own devotional realization that leads him to perceive the other system in that way. So it's not pushing for the interpretation, but understanding. And the notion of Brahman as the seat of opposing attributes is therefore not just the hermeneutical prism or conceptual summation of his exegesis, but also points out to the numinous reality of supremely beloved Lord Krishna, to whom he volitionally and absolutely subjects. So he's submitting himself out of will, with the realization that he's actually one and the same. So that's the culmination.
Under the four-fold system of scriptural testimony, he said some exegetical position,
which is probably the philosophical standpoint he's arriving through his scriptural exegeses. So through his scriptural commentaries and the method of interpreting the scriptures, what is the philosophical standpoint he's arriving at, the darshana?
I wanted to thank you for the presentation. I wanted to respond to the two different parts of your presentation. The initial part, which was more theoretical in nature, and then the second part, which was more specifically focused on Vallabha and his commentary. So on the first part, I was thinking, each of the speakers before this, or at least myself and D'Souza, we mentioned how hermeneutics is born, and I think Dr. Madhavi also, that hermeneutics is born in biblical interpretation. And we made that point very, very clear, and then used some of those terminology to discuss it. I think in the initial part of your presentation, what you remind us of is the fact that although hermeneutics may be born of biblical interpretation, that's not where it can stay if we want to apply it to Sanskrit literature. In other words, any hermeneutical method has to be adapted or born from, formed by the tradition to which it's applied, right? So that it doesn't become... I think what I was struck by is the fact that you reminded us that hermeneutics, as we know of it in the West, when we speak of hermeneutics today, we are engaged in essentially a comparative exercise, where we're using hermeneutics, biblical hermeneutics, and applying it to Sanskrit literature. We're engaged in a process that is essentially comparative, because we're talking about two different traditions that are being collided together. And so we ought to think of biblical hermeneutics not only as a model, but also as an interlocutor, as a discussant, and sometimes even as the Purvapaksha. Because the assumptions that underlie those systems of hermeneutics in biblical and in Sanskrit literature are different, as Dr. Bose pointed out, and you pointed out at the beginning of your presentation. So that was the point that struck me, because I think that point needs to be stated. Otherwise, we can continue looking at a hermeneutical system that is external to the tradition, continuously as a model of engagement, and I think that leaves out other possibilities, such as a comparative exercise that's present. So that was one thing that really struck me. The other thing is I think a lot of the hermeneutical circles and things that we were talking about, you demonstrated in your work. You kind of gave an example of it in your own process
That was
as
my
a doctoral
personal
student.
struggle.
Yes, yes. And so in that way it was very valuable because it was a real application of what we were talking about. And then the splits that you had spoken about at the very beginning, how one of the things that makes Western hermeneutics different than a hermeneutics that would be born in Indian traditions is the lack of separation, of splits, these Cartesian splits that we find regularly. And I think you mentioned several: culture and religion, philosophy and theology, epistemology and metaphysics.
Yes.
And in that regard, it struck me how, I don't know if this is the case in India, but in the United States, every department in the humanities has been suitably globalized in its perspective. Literature, they teach a variety of world literatures, and history teaches world history, except for departments of philosophy. Philosophy departments are still, I would say, 90% focused exclusively on Western philosophy because of this underlying assumption that you provided in that quotation from, who was it, the Upanishadic skeptic? Yeah. That there is no, it's not proper philosophy. Why? Because it's too religious in nature. And that criticism that India has no philosophy because it's just religion is not a criticism of India, but it's a demonstration of the assumptions of the person who is criticizing. Namely, the fact that philosophy and religion are essentially separate disciplines altogether. And I think that underlies so much of hermeneutical thought in the West, is these Cartesian splits between philosophy, religion,
and most of our scriptures have been reinterpreted using that. And the reminder was actually that, as you mentioned earlier, that every translation is a hermeneutical exercise. So whether it's explicitly stated or not, but we do have our own original method of hermeneutics, which we forget to apply while interpreting our own scriptures. That was the reminder.
Thank you. Thank you for that reminder. And then on the second part of your presentation, just a small comment on the more technical aspects. In my study of Jiva Goswami, he uses very similar language of sarva. He calls Brahman sarva viruddha dharma ashraya.
Yes. I have come across it in your readings as well.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is that the reasoning process that he uses to get there is in many ways parallel to what you described with Vallabha. In his Bhagavata Sandarbha, he gives different attributes of Brahman and says that they both must be held, all opposites together. And that very fact of Brahman being sarva viruddha dharma ashraya leads to the quality of achintya, which is of course a key factor in Gaudiya Vedanta. And that achintyatva though leads to this sense of wonderment in Brahman, which leads to the increase of bhakti. The devotee's bhakti is increased by the contradiction. Rather than leading to confusion, it leads to wonderment, which increases bhakti, which I think you said was the result in Vallabha as well. Right?
Yeah,
so I just thought that was an interesting kind of parallel in terms of the two. And the last thing I'll say is it's just something I liked, which you mentioned how in the process of Leela, when the Lord is performing Leela, he is both the spectator and the performer of Leela. I thought that was a wonderful point. So,
thank you.
I want to thank you as well. It was a very well written paper, and I think it makes you a better researcher, contrary to what you may say. I have some general observations which I think are relevant to all of our presentations, that the Western hermeneutic tradition begins with a presumption of a division between speech and writing. where writing is being seen as something, some act, which is always addressed to the perpetual absentee reader. So speech in opposition to writing, speech is prioritized over writing.
Yes.
And the hermeneutic turn was all about trying to read, to reconfigure the original authorial intention from the reader's perspective.
Yeah.
So hermeneutics is all about this absent, forever absent and never tangible reader,
Yeah.
the addressee. But in the Indian context, is there such a defined division, separation between speech and writing? Speech and writing are simultaneous things.
Yeah.
So even from that vantage, I think the Indian hermeneutics can be thought of a simultaneous rereading of speech and writing together.
Yeah.
Because
I acknowledge that I have not thought from that perspective. So it's a new perspective that we can all think about.
Yes.
But I do acknowledge that we as Indian tradition really hate systems. So we have never really designed a system for anything. So we have a hermeneutical engagement, but we never have a system of hermeneutics like West does. And that's, I feel, is the predominant reason that we actually use their model, because we don't have a model. We have it integrated in our commentaries, but we don't have a model.
Yes.
And Vallabha is a very cryptic writer, and I'm sure I've not studied other acharyas as much as I've studied him, but he's so cryptic. He names his commentary Nibandh, which means prose, and I think it's a nasty, misleading name. It's nothing prosaic about it. It's very, so he writes commentary in the form of sutras, 4 sutras. So it's a nightmare. So that's the struggle with Indian scholars. We do not have a system. We have to dig out system from there.
thank you, thank you.
Field of Sanskrit literature called Tantra Yukti, which is not exactly hermeneutics, but it is a form of understanding and interpreting text, which is used in the Arthashastra. The Arthashastra gives a number of yuktis, and it is also used in the context of Ayurveda. I mean, I'm just adding. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah.